Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Monday, the 29th. And I wanted to remind you that I'm going to be out of town for the next two classes, the 1st and the 6th of October. So I won't be posting any videos, but use your time efficiently and effectively. This is an opportunity for you to get ahead with the readings, certainly to catch up with the readings if you're in that position, and to work on paper number one. And I mostly wanted to talk about the construction of papers today in the event that you did want to spend some time writing. Before I do that, though, I wanted to briefly mention that when I return, we will be talking about Edgar Allan Poe and specifically his short stories, The Fall of the House of Usher, and you can see this in the third section in the notes below, Mask of Red Death, The Telltale Heart, and The Black Cat. Obviously, Poe has many more stories, but just because of time, I limited it to four stories that I think will give us a good overview about Poe as we make determinations as to whether or not Lovecraft was correct in his assessment about Poe's brilliance. And after Edgar Allan Poe, we are reading the novella Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And a novella is longer than a short story, so it's longer than Poe's works, but it is shorter than a novel, so it's shorter than Frankenstein. So I've included the links for all of those in the third section below in the event that you wanted to get ahead. And in terms of the paper, as you know, it is not a research paper, it is a critical paper, so you shouldn't be using any outside resources. You should basically be relying on your own interpretations and learning from the class itself. In our syllabus and other documents folder, I have a handout that I would have distributed in a face-to-face class entitled The Critical Paper, which reviews the conventions for writing a paper. And I'm hopeful that this is a review. This is something that you would have discussed in your previous English classes. And in effect, you should know that this handout was given to me when I was an undergraduate student, and I've kept it all these years. It's still one of the best that I have found in terms of reviewing how to write a paper, but there are places where it'll sound a little bit dated, and I'll get to that in a moment. And I do recommend that you print the documents that are in the syllabus and other documents folder so that you can easily access them, because that's what I'm going to be talking about now, the handout that's entitled The Critical Paper, where basically it's divided up into three stages: planning, writing, and editing. I can tell you that most authors write incorrectly. They go straight to the writing phase, try to write the perfect first sentence, end up becoming quite frustrated, and end up probably not writing very much until the very last minute. And that is usually the worst way to go about writing a paper. You really want to spend some time planning and thinking, which is what I encourage you to do now. And underneath the section about planning, you're reminded that your job is to analyze, not to summarize. So it's not what I call the junior high school book report to prove that you read something, showing what happened. We are at the stage of trying to determine why did those things happen. So assume the reader is familiar with the text and that you are just confining your comments to those areas that are necessary for you to retell for your argument. A grammatical way of saying this: confine your comments on plot to subordinate clauses and emphasize in the main clause the significance of that action. In other words, the bulk of your sentences should be based on interpretation, not summary. And the thesis, the main point of your paper, can be quite tricky because you may not necessarily know what your thesis is until you're done writing your paper. But how do you write a paper if you don't know what your thesis is? So it is a kind of catch-22, but that's part of the process of writing a paper, is discovering and learning. So I've had many students who have basically written the thesis last. They read everything they've written, they summarize it in a sentence or two, and then they plug that into the introductory paragraph because that's the expectation of where the thesis would be in your introduction, in your first paragraph. So There are some examples of the handout of a thesis that wouldn't necessarily be particularly effective. So, saying something, for instance, like Shakespeare explores the complexities of experience is so broad, it really applies to every author and every text. So, that would not be a good thesis. Or saying something like Shakespeare employs much imagery in Hamlet. Most authors apply and or employ imagery, and the question is what imagery is employed and how and why is it used. So in your introduction, you need to remember that that paragraph needs to be minimum 3 sentences. You need to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Your paragraph and all of the following paragraphs will probably be much longer than that, but if it's less than 3 sentences, it's not an academic paragraph. I understand that in journalism you might have 1 or 2 sentence paragraphs, but not in academic writing or in the writing of the workplace. And a well written paragraph, more often than not, has what we call a topic sentence. The first sentence of the paragraph that basically summarizes what the paragraph is about. And if that were the case, you should be able to read the first sentences of all of your paragraphs and get a kind of outline. And you might even want to try this with some text that you might be reading. Now, textbooks are notoriously poorly written, but if you've got a well written textbook, you should be able to read just the first sentences and get a kind of summary. And your job is basically to provide evidence. You're much like an attorney in a courtroom, and I'm much like the judge. It doesn't matter what my personal opinion is. I need to rely on the evidence that is provided to me as judge from the attorney. A good attorney can argue either position, defense or prosecution. And of course, one side might have more evidence than another, but a good attorney knows how to turn the evidence that does exist into the strongest argument possible. And that's what basically you're doing, is that you are taking a position upon which reasonable people could disagree and you are supporting it with evidence. My job is basically to take the opposite position until you have provided enough evidence to convince. And the convincing, it just needs to be possible, not even probable. The way you convince is by using quotation and paraphrase and argumentation. Paraphrase is when you put some of the text in your own words, and quotation is when you use the language of the text itself word for word. And you want to have a combination of the two, and more on that later. So, what you don't want to do is have the extremes. So you don't want to have a paper that's padded with too much quotation because you're trying to lengthen the paper. Better to have a shorter paper that is well written than a longer paper that is wordy or that is using quotation unnecessarily. Likewise, you don't want to have a paper with no quotation, so you need to have some evidence as well. And generally speaking, ending a paragraph with a quote is considered bad practice only because you usually comment on the relevance of the quote. So that means you would probably do such a thing. Now, that said, you have a concluding paragraph that basically ties up everything and gives a sense of closure. And that paragraph, that last paragraph, needs to be also minimum 3 sentences, hopefully a lot longer. And try to find an interesting way to conclude. I understand you're tired by that point. You've said everything by that point. Perhaps you can hint at a related idea or apply your thesis to another work by the same author. Don't just recopy the introduction and change a word or two. So, the writing phase. And I had a very wise professor in college once say that a paper's never done. You just have to hand it in at some point. And it's true, you could spend a lifetime polishing your writing, and you don't have that kind of time. None of us do. So you do the best you can with the time that you have. And as I had suggested, I put a due date approximately midway through the semester, though I have rolling deadlines. And it's a good idea to have some feedback by the midpoint of the semester. So if you haven't handed in your paper by the midpoint of the semester, you should reach out to me and keep me apprised. And certainly you can hand in a paper early. So once you know what it is that you're going to be writing about, And the first paper would be addressing the earlier texts of the semester. So probably that would be either Frankenstein or Poe's short stories or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And while we began with Lovecraft and Stephen King, those aren't pieces of literature per se. They were more investigations into what Gothic and supernatural literature is. So certainly you can reference them, but that wouldn't be a literary analysis. The literary analysis would be on one of the fiction texts that we are reading. And you would be doing something comparable with paper number 2 towards the ending of the semester, just with one of the later works of the semester. So the first principle of good writing is economy, and the second is simplicity. Say as much as possible in as few words as possible. I cannot emphasize this enough. Basically, the hope is that you finished your paper early enough so that you could set it aside, not look at it, not think about it for a little while, so that when you return to it, you can find errors and literally go through each sentence and ask yourself, can I say this in fewer words without sacrificing meaning? And if the answer is yes, 9 out of 10 times you should say it in fewer words. I understand it's painful because ultimately that is going to shorten the length of your paper. But again, better to have a paper that is well written, that's shorter, than a longer paper that has a lot of unnecessary language or quotation that's purely there just to lengthen the paper. I had suggested your paper should be approximately 4 to 5 pages, but approximately is approximately. Your paper should be as long as it needs to be for you to be able to support your thesis. And good writing depends on strong verbs and nouns, adjectives and adverbs, descriptive words. Be careful. Don't use them merely to pad the paper. Don't use lots of synonyms, for instance, words with similar meanings, just to lengthen a paper. And prefer the active to the passive voice. So you want it to be very clear when you're writing your sentences that the subject of the sentence is engaged in the action rather than the action occurring to the subject of the sentence. So take two simple sentences like, Lillian taught the class as opposed to the class was taught by Lillian. While both are grammatically correct, one is preferable. Lillian taught the class because it's very clear that Lillian, the subject of the sentence, is engaged in the verb, the teaching, as opposed to the class was taught by Lillian. It was almost as if the teaching is happening to Lillian. But if that seems too complex, just count the number of words in the sentences. Lillian taught the class is 4 words. The class was taught by Lillian is 6 words. It's a minor difference, but a difference nonetheless. And remember, the principle of good writing is economy. Say as much as you can say in as few words as possible. So in this instance, opt for the sentence with 4 rather than 6 words. And if you do that, you would be avoiding the passive tense. So vary your sentences. So you should have a mix of long and short sentences because a lot of long sentences, one after another, makes the writing very dense. And a lot of short sentences, one after the other, makes the writing very choppy. And you want to make sure that you're varying your sentence beginning so that you don't have multiple sentences in a row beginning with the same word. Again, a paragraph is a developed idea, so no 1 or 2 sentence paragraphs. And avoid cliches. These are overused expressions that no longer have any kind of originality. Interestingly, many of them were created by Shakespeare. People are quoting Shakespeare all the time and don't even realize it. But the reason why we want you to avoid cliches and also slang, informal language, is because there's just a greater possibility for misunderstanding. So just think about some of the expressions we use in our day. It's raining cats and dogs. What do cats and dogs have to do with rain? Why do cats have to go first before dogs? And think about slang. You know, when you say somebody is a cool person, you're saying that they're interesting. But technically, cool isn't related to temperature. And imagine if English were not your first language, it would be confusing. And I always tell a little story from real life. I try to tell humorous stories. Unfortunately, this one is not a humorous story, but it occurred several decades ago. And it illustrates the importance of being clear in language. It was a story about a student who was going to a Halloween party, I believe it was. It was a party, definitely. And he ended up going to the wrong home, a home that had been burglarized previously. So the owner was, shall we say, jittery. And when the student approached the home, the student asked, "Is this where the party is happening?" And the owner replied with a piece of slang, "Freeze," which means to stop. But for whatever reason, the student misheard, misunderstood, took a step forward. The owner's response was to take out the gun that he always carried and shoot that student dead on his doorstep. So all because of a misunderstanding with language. So it completely changed how languages were taught in classrooms. Also, I can tell you that while it's important to know the academic language of writing, it's also important to know the language of the streets because we speak differently than we write. But if you're curious as to why we have these rules with writing, is to try to avoid misunderstanding that there's some sort of standardization or expectation of what a standard piece of writing would look like. And that means avoid cliches, and it also means to avoid slang. And even though this seems counterintuitive, you want to keep in the present tense. The action is occurring now, even though you've read about it in the past, and even though I know it was written in the past. So you're saying Victor says to the creature, not that Victor said to the creature. So you're keeping it in the present tense. And if this is a little bit too difficult for you, just change everything around from the past to the present when you're going through your editing. Also, when you're doing a literary analysis, avoid the use of I. The "I think," "I will argue," "I feel," all of that is embedded within the paper. So the assumption is that, of course, this is how you think or what you will argue. Again, if this is difficult, when the editing phase comes about, then you can just delete the I's. So that leaves us ultimately with the presentation. And again, this is an area that oftentimes writers skip because they've run out of time or they've run out of energy or both. So you want to save a little bit of energy and time for the end and avoid mistakes in previous papers. All of you have the option of rewriting the first paper for a higher grade. I see the first paper as a learning exercise. And in theory, you wouldn't need to rewrite your second paper because you would have learned from your first paper. So do take my comments into account. And if you have trouble concentrating when you are proofreading, a tip might be for you to actually try to read your paper backwards. Of course, it won't make sense. And then you can focus on things like grammar and mechanics. You need to have a title. Your title should be original, so you don't want to call your paper, for instance, Frankenstein, because that title's already been taken by Mary Shelley. Now, certainly you can embed in your own title within the title, so you can talk about something like conflict in Frankenstein. And we do have conventions for indicating whether a published text, no, it's a published text, is a longer work or a shorter work. And if it's a shorter work, it is placed in quotation marks. You might have noticed this on our course outline when I was referencing Poe's short stories. If it's a longer work, you either put it in italics or you underline it, because of course if you were handwriting or writing on a whiteboard, you wouldn't be able to write italics, so you'd underline it. So something like that, the title Frankenstein, if you were using part of that title within your own title, that would be underlined, the word Frankenstein. But your title does not need to be underlined in its entirety nor put into quotation marks because it hasn't been published. In that first paragraph, by the way, in addition to your thesis, you should give the name of the work and the author so it's very clear to the reader as to what you are discussing. And to illustrate the age of this handout, instructors prefer typewritten papers. This paper does have to be typed. Double spaced, 1-inch margin. We're using the MLA, Modern Language Association system for documentation, which I'm hopeful is something that you would have talked about in a previous English class. They come up with the rules for the humanities and languages. And the rules basically are just to provide a sense of consistency and There are slightly different rules for different disciplines. So you want to make sure you're using the correct format for the correct discipline. We're using the MLA, Modern Language Association, again for languages. In the sciences, you use a slightly different system, the APA, or the American Psychological Association. Both have the same goal, to provide the reader with enough information so that ultimately they could find the original source that you are quoting or referencing and verify its authenticity. But again, there's slight differences in the way that you go about doing that. So you want to make sure that you are using the correct system, which is the MLA. And I have a couple of websites to recommend to you that you can see in the notes below as well, both in the first and second section. Purdue OWL, which you might be familiar with. It is a website from Purdue University that reviews the entire process of writing. It is free to the public, so you don't need to be a student of Purdue. And the GCC library, your tuition dollars at work. And basically, the library is well aware you will be writing a paper, so they too have talked about some of the conventions for writing a paper, which you can review. And the systems work almost like a cookbook, for lack of a better comparison, that you look up the particular situation you have and then you just follow the directions exactly. So there are certain elements that you need to indicate if you are quoting from, let's say, a magazine article as opposed to a website, as opposed to a book. And again, the way that all of this works is that you use your quotation marks to indicate that you're using a direct quote. And then immediately after the quote, whether you're done with your sentence or not is irrelevant, you use parentheses. That's called parenthetical documentation. Within those parentheses, you put the least amount of information necessary for the reader to be able to determine where your quote comes from. Usually that means something like a page number, but if it's unclear, you might want to add something like the author's surname or even part of the title if you've got multiple texts from the same author. And then you close your parentheses and you either continue your sentence or you end your sentence. And all of this works with a works cited page at the very ending of the paper that lists all of the works that you've quoted from, the books and the magazine articles and so forth and so on. All of that is listed by author's last name alphabetically. And again, slight different variations for how you would cite a book as opposed to a website, so forth and so on. The good news for us is we aren't writing a research paper. We're not using outside resources. So, in theory, you're just using the actual text itself. And that means that, as far as I'm concerned, you don't necessarily have to submit in a works cited page. You could, and if you do, you want to make sure that it's correct. But all I want is that you are using parenthetical documentation within the body of the text. And you can see this in the second section, the notes below, where I've given you some examples. So punctuation goes after documentation. For instance, quote, Krebs went to the war from a Methodist college, unquote, and then in parentheses, 162, close parentheses, and then a period in this instance. Or if your sentence were to continue, let it continue. Quote, although Krebs went to the war from a Methodist college, unquote, and then in parentheses 162 for the page number. Notice I'm not writing page or PG or anything like that, just the actual number. And then I continue my sentence. He cannot pray with his mother, period. And you can insert things into a quotation. We use square brackets for that. And you usually insert your own voice in a quotation when you need to clarify something. For instance, a pronoun, if you want to be clear as to who the pronoun is referencing. It's almost like interrupting someone when you do that. So you want to be very cautious that you don't overdo that. And certainly you can comment on the relevance of the quote before or after the quote. But if you need to insert yourself into the middle of a quote, the way you would do that is with square brackets. So anything in square brackets is not part of the original quote, it's your insertion. And I've given an example of that. Quote, even his, and then after the word his in square brackets, I have Krebs's. I put the name of the character so it's clear who I'm referencing. And then I close my square brackets. His lies were not sensational. And then, of course, my parenthetical documentation. Or you can omit something from a quote, and you want to omit something because it's not relevant, not because you want to change the meaning of a quote. And you don't have to worry about this for the beginning or the ending of the quote, because the assumption is that text comes before and after where you've decided to begin and end your quote. But between your start point and your stop point, if you leave something out, a word or several words, you use what's called an ellipsis, or three periods, or three dots. And I've given that example in the notes below as well. So if you ever see that in a quote, that means that something has been omitted. And if you have a long quote, and I guess that, is up to debate. Generally speaking, it's over 3 lines. You block it off. You've probably seen this in text where you have a quote that's indented inward, and that makes it very easy for the reader to see where the quote begins and, more importantly, ends. So if you have a quote that's over 3 lines, not 3 sentences, about 3 lines of text, you would do that. And for some reason, the punctuation comes first and then the parenthetical documentation. I'm honestly not sure why, but that is the way that the convention is. So you want to follow the convention. So this gives you a little bit of an idea of some of the things to consider with writing a paper. Also, try to avoid contractions if possible. Not that they're wrong, but words like don't or can't or won't is considered to be somewhat informal. So better to say do not or cannot or will not. So that was just a quick review of some of the elements that you want to consider in terms of your paper. Your paper should have also a title page, which is just a separate sheet of paper or a separate screen, if you will, that lists the title, your name, my name, the due date, and so forth. According to the MLA, there's no particular formatting you have to follow. In fact, the MLA will say that you don't necessarily need to submit in a title page unless your instructor requests one, and I'm requesting one. So that said, we'll talk more about the paper when I return. We will also talk more about Edgar Allan Poe when I return, and our attendance question, which would be due on Wednesday the 1st, and certainly if you need additional time, let me know, is what questions, if any, do you have about paper number 1 at this point? And if you have no questions, just say no questions, and that'll satisfy the requirement for answering that question. And as you know, you're not required to respond to your peers. You're encouraged to, but you are required to read your peers' responses and my responses in turn. So again, no class on the 1st and the 6th. 10-1 is Wednesday. 10-6 is Monday. So use your time efficiently and effectively. And when we return, we'll talk about Edgar Allan Poe and begin Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on in a week. Take care. Bye-bye.